Hi everyone. I'm Ben Cooney. I'm a senior JavaScript engineer. This is what I look like. I'm going to talk to you today about some arcane JavaScript syntax. So think, the kind of stuff that you wouldn't see too often, maybe a bit quirky, kind of syntax you'd see in an old dusty bowl in a wizard's tower somewhere. So start back in May 1995, which is when Netscape Navigator 2 was released. And that was the first version of an internet browser that contained JavaScript. And famously, the version of JavaScript that was included here was designed in 10 days by someone called Brendan Eich. And this fact sometimes gets used as a stick to hit JavaScript with. How could they make a great language in 10 days? And to some extent it's true, but JavaScript hasn't stayed as that language that was developed in 10 days. We've had all this time since then to add on new weird bits. So let's take a look at some of those. We'll start with void. Void is probably my favorite piece of JavaScript syntax. It came along in Netscape Navigator 3, so the next major version release in August 1996. And you might not see it too often, but I bet you've seen it somewhere. So let's say you're listening to some banging tunes, you're typing out while you're coding, you're just tuned in on YouTube, and you see a concert link, so you hover over it, and the link at the bottom, instead of telling you where it's going to take you, it just says JavaScript : void brackets 0. What's going on there? So at first glance, it kind of looks like a function, right? You kind of think, okay, well, they're calling something called void, and they're passing 0 as an argument. But those brackets are completely optional. You could just as easily, in JavaScript, write void followed by 0 with no brackets. And it's not clear when they use it with 0, but the argument that you pass to this void thing is evaluated and then thrown away, and then the entire thing results in undefined. Kind of weird, not immediately clear why this is useful or why they added it. And these brackets, you could kind of think of void as like an exclamation mark or a not syntax. It's from a class of syntax called unary expressions, where unary is like one. And it just means it's a piece of syntax that takes one other expression. And the brackets, you could use those with a not as well, just showing you how they're kind of similar. They're just completely optional parts, and the parser will just completely ignore them. So Netscape Navigator 3 looked like this. Lots of different shades of grey. Looks absolutely stunning. But along with the browser, they released some JavaScript documentation. So here's what they say about void. A lot of this is what we've been over before, but you can see here in what I've highlighted in yellow, you can use the void operator to specify an expression as a hyperlinked text. The expression is evaluated, but is not loaded in place of the current document. Okay, we're getting a bit closer to why this exists. Here's where they specify all the different things you could have as the target of a link. So URLs, FTP, regular things. And you can also have a link specify that it will execute some JavaScript. The JavaScript protocol evaluates the expression after the colon, if there is one, and loads a page containing the string value of the expression, unless it is undefined. So whatever function you have after this JavaScript colon will be evaluated, and if it returns something, the user will be taken to a page showing just that text, or the text representation of whatever you've returned. If the expression evaluates to undefined by calling the void function, for example, no new page loads. So at the time, you didn't really have a whole lot of ways to build clickable behavior into your web pages. You had kind of buttons and links. And if you wanted click behavior, then you'd have to use this JavaScript syntax, but people were finding that it was inconvenient because it kept taking users to new pages. So Void was kind of introduced to make this developer flow easy to add interaction to your pages. At the time, JavaScript didn't really have a good way of getting hold of undefined. Recently, you might use undefined throughout your code, but at the time it was kind of tricky to get hold of. And so we'll jump ahead to edition 3 of the ECMAScript language specification. So at this point in time, JavaScript's all grown up. It's got a new name. This was released in March 2000. And they've added a new property to the global object called undefined. So we finally got a way to get hold of undefined easily. We don't have to keep calling void. And then there's a few properties associated with this. We've got don't enum and don't delete. Okay, that all seems reasonable to have on a global undefined property. But then what you don't realize is there's other properties like read only that were suspiciously missing. The implications of this is that if you wanted to, you could override the global undefined with a new value. And cause all kinds of problems. So here's the current Mozilla documentation for the global undefined property. You can see in all non-legacy browsers, undefined is a non-configurable, non-writable property. Even when this is not the case, avoid overriding it. So it's just it's going to give you a bad time if you touch that undefined property. So we'll jump ahead a bit. ECMAScript 5 in December 2009. And ECMAScript 5 introduced something called strict mode. And for strict mode, they took the opportunity to kind of strip out or deprecate a load of JavaScript features that were error prone or undesirable for whatever reason. And if you're like me, the interesting part is, wow, what did they take out? What's all the weirdness that they've closed off from us being able to use? So here's some real test data taken from a production application. We've got a cool person object with the name Ben, and we're using it here in this with block. So when this evaluates, we say we want to use this cool person as our with target, and when this console.log runs, it'll see the identifier name. And instead of resolving that identifier normally, it'll first look within this object to see if there's anything called name. And if it is, that'll be what it uses as the value for that identifier. So in this case, it'll log Ben. Seems a bit esoteric. Why exactly might you find that useful, or why was it added in the first place? Well, just like one example of the kind of thing you could achieve with it. If we passed an array to with, then you wouldn't keep needing to say myArray.join or things like that anytime you wanted to do any behaviors on the array. You could just do console.log join. So an example of why this with feature is maybe not so safe to use. I've got a simple function. It takes a message and a data object. And we're using this data object in with, and we're just going to log out whatever's coming in as a parameter for the message. And so we'll call that function with log me as the message, and nothing exciting about this data object to begin with. And the message log me is just going to be logged out. So what happens when we do something like this, and our data object contains a property called message? Well, within the with block, remember, it'll see message and it'll not use its normal rules for determining how to resolve an identifier. Instead, it'll look on this object first and it'll find this value called sneaky. This doesn't just work for user-specified identifiers. Consider this example. We can override default parts of the browser behavior with maybe you wouldn't have a case as bad as this where it's deleting your prod database, but something unexpected is going to happen. So broadly, within this with block, it's very difficult to reason about what's going to happen when the program runs. And And that's true for developers, but it's also true for compilers or interpreters. Anything that's running this code is going to find it very difficult to optimize the statements inside, just because they're going to behave so differently depending on what data is around when the function runs. So July 2023, we'll jump ahead and see what kind of funky things are still in JavaScript that we can use. So JavaScript has an OR statement. So the value of short circuit will be whether either of these is true. And in this case, because the left-hand side is true, we'll get this short circuit behavior, and the right-hand side won't be evaluated because it already knows that the result is going to be true. So true will get assigned to short circuit. We've also got a ternary. So we have a condition part that will be evaluated, and if it looks true, then we'll get the left-hand side of the colon, which is yes. If it's false, we'll get the right-hand side, which is no. And we can combine these in interesting ways. So neither of them are particularly exciting on their own. But what about if we combine them like this, for example? If we have A or condition, question mark B, colon C. Well, it's not exactly immediately clear how the language is going to handle this, because there's a couple of possibilities. One is it could do this OR behavior first and work out whether it should be doing A or condition, and then using that to work out which side of the ternary it falls into. Or it could be doing A or this entire ternary expression. So it turns out that in this case, the first result is the behavior we'll see. So it will do A or the condition, and that will evaluate to true because A is truthy as a string. And so we'll fall down the left-hand side of the ternary and we'll get the result B. And this is, you might think back to when you were in school doing maths, you had BODMAS or PEMDAS or any of those telling you in which order you should do mathematical operations. And similar to that, we can use brackets to kind of clarify our intent and explain exactly what we want to happen. If we don't use the brackets, it'll use operator precedence, and operator precedence effectively specifies which of these takes priority when it's evaluating language. And so the OR operator has precedence 3, so it's evaluated first, whereas the ternary is precedence 2. So let's say we decide to include those brackets in our code, and then we run it through a code linter, like we use here at Trainline. And that says, well, these brackets are redundant. I'll just strip them out for you and it'll work exactly the same. So even if we try and make our intent clear, sometimes that'll get cleaned up and taken away from us. So that precedence table has some other fun things in it. If you scroll right down to the bottom, the least important part of the JavaScript syntax, according to this table at least, is the comma or sequence operator. You don't really see this often, but let's take a look at what it does. So effectively, if we have a series of expressions using commas, it'll evaluate the first one, and then the second one, and then more if we're chaining commas. So in this example, console.log will be evaluated, and we'll see a log here. And then result will be evaluated, we'll get a string, and that will be the result of the expression as a whole, and that will get assigned to example. So when we log out example, we'll see result. Again, not super clear why this might be useful, but people do find uses for it. So here's some class inheritance syntax, and we're using TypeScript to compile this back to an older version of JavaScript. And to support this, TypeScript has generated a whole load of boilerplate for old JavaScript versions that don't have this object inheritance syntax built in. And we can see this is the only place where I've ever seen a comma used in the wild. I won't dive into what this does. I think that would be a very boring talk. But yeah, if you're using tools that generate code that is designed to be small because it's going to be used in a whole load of different websites and shipped over millions of network connections. Maybe you can use this comma to write some really small, compact code. Okay, for loop fizzbuzz. So there's loads of loops in JavaScript. Basic for loops, for each, for of, that kind of thing. I'm just interested in basic for loops because even within those, there's a whole load of variants for which parts of them you can use or not. So it's a bit obscure, but this is kind of like the language definition in the ECMAScript spec for loops. We can see there's 3 parts like we might expect. So we've got a place where we can declare our variable. We've got a place where we can have an expression that will be evaluated each time, where we can check if we're still running the loop, or whether we need to stop. And we've got another expression where we can increment our iterator each time. And at the end, we have a statement. In practice, that would be the body of your loop, the block or a single statement for the thing you actually care about doing each time. But notice that a lot of these have opt labels, which means they're optional, so we don't actually have to use them. And even this statement, it turns out that one of the types of statement you can use is an empty statement. So loops are fairly well defined, and you've seen them everywhere, and they look pretty normal every time you see them. But actually, there's a whole load of bits that you don't need and you can just throw away. So let's look through an example. We'll look at fizzbuzz, quite a common interview exercise. So in fizzbuzz, we're going to loop through some numbers. In this case, we'll go through 20 numbers. And for each number, if it's divisible by 3, we'll log fizz. If it's divisible by 5, we'll log buzz. If it's divisible by both 3 and 5, we'll log fizzbuzz. Otherwise, we'll just log the number. So the first thing to note is that this part at the end of the loop declaration, it's just a place where we can increment our variable each time, but there's not actually any checks placed on it. So it's kind of redundant. What we could do instead is we can increment at the same time as we check our condition. And there we go, okay, we're using less parts of this for loop. And then the body of this loop is just a whole load of if-else statements. So using the ternary statement that we've seen before, we can actually crunch that down into an awful looking line of code, as we see here. You'll have to take my word for it that this does exactly the same thing. And now that we've done that, because we know that we can use this comma operator to sequence instructions together, we can cram that up in the top as well. So there's a slightly clearer version down at the bottom where we say we're using the variable declaration, but then in the second part of our loop, we're doing the work and then incrementing and checking whether we're out of the loop at the same time. So if ever you get asked in an interview to say, can you implement fizzbuzz using a for loop? You can tell them, I can do it using half a for loop. I guarantee you'll get the job. What have we learned? Okay, so my notes for this just say, try to keep a straight face. JavaScript has grown and evolved over time. There was weird bits at the start, and there's been weird bits added on as it's grown. And learning about them is fun, and hopefully makes you a bit of a better programmer, understanding why these parts of the language exist. You can understand why the language looks like that. You might commonly hear like, oh, there's best practices to not use this, or we've got linting tools that disallow this, but it's understanding why those linting tools are in place or why those pieces of advice are there that kind of give you a bit of a clue about how things have changed over time and why they are the way they are. So I'll finish with, I've written a haiku about my favorite piece of JavaScript syntax. Return nothingness, void resolving, undefined, void evaluates. You may have guessed This is also valid JavaScript. And what's cute about this is that this haiku about void, well, these identifiers, they'll just get thrown away because we're using with, so identifiers don't really matter. And then we're using commas, so all the different parts of it aren't really relevant, it's just this last bit. And then this last bit begins with a void. So when we execute my haiku, it will return undefined. Thank you.